Hi y'all, I'm Keri Stephens from the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm so happy to be with you here at TFMA to talk about Texas tools that we're developing and the state has developed to try to help us move from technical information to non-technical flood information. Now, you all probably know that there's a whole lot of great flooding work that's been done in Texas. You know, we have dashboards, we have a lot of different maps and models, we have the Texas flood quilt, lots of tools. However, in the process of creating these tools, we've also realized some huge gaps exist. And I'm really going to talk a lot about how we're going to close those gaps today. Because one of the challenges we have is that with technical flood experts, we're really good at identifying technical solutions. And we think, oh my gosh, I have this great idea. No, I just need other people to implement it, right? Of course, that's what we all do. However, human behavior doesn't always work that way. So what we see happening is that humans don't use the data the way we expect, and it's really messy. And a lot of the reason is that sometimes we're treating humans as passive recipients of information. So I want you to kind of think about the public for a little bit, because the public tends to ignore information that's too technical or not salient. And think about it. You know, if somebody throws information at you and you don't understand it, to save face, you're going to ignore it. It's really what it boils down to. The other thing is that the public often listens to non-experts because they trust them, okay? They also need to trust that information in the source. Sometimes they trust official sources, but sometimes they don't. And then the other thing we've all got to remember is that they don't necessarily make rational decisions. A lot of times the decisions we make are emotional. So my goal here today is to really help you see how we're trying to transition our thinking about the public and our less technical audiences. And by the way, that can be a lot of different stakeholders that we interact with. From being those passive recipients, so we just put that information out there and expect them to implement it. And instead, we want them to be active participants. So that what they're doing is they're making systems and processes functional. So we make our lives a lot better. What we really need is we need these flood tools to bridge the gap from all this technical information that we're putting together all the way into moving people to making good flood action decisions. So today I'm going to talk about several different things, share some resources with you, some of the project tools for public audiences that are out there. I'll also talk a little bit about the Texas Integrated Flooding Framework that was just created, or finalized I should say, in around early 2026. Then I'll also share an example of how one of the projects I'm working on, we're actually applying those TIF guidelines to really make a tool for local flood officials. All right, first of all, let's talk about some of these projects and products that have been created. I do have a QR code here. You can take a look at some of the latest work that my research teams have been involved in. But one of the first things that I want to share with you is there is a guide out there on the Water Development Board's website for local flood officials. So I'll talk some about that. I'll also talk about a survey that my team did for Texans and some flood communication and prioritized groups and messages that we have designed as well. So if you Google flood guide for local flood officials, Water Development Board, up will come this flood resource guide. Now, I want to show you an example of what's on the resource guide, but the resource guide was compiled by doing a lot of literature reviews and also looking out for great tools around the globe that are designed to try to communicate about flood risk. Now, the guide itself is very specific to Texas, and so it's our issues, our concerns. You'll see that on each part of the guide, there's a brief overview. We have narrowed it down to the top 3 resources that can help you as local flood officials be able to share information with your audiences. There will be descriptions and links to those sources. And then finally, occasionally, we could find videos or we could find translations. And if there are more materials, you'll see some icons there that will show you how to link to that. So that's out there and available for your use right now. Another thing that we did that's really kind of getting background information about how do Texans seek flood information. Because boy, if we could get everybody to be proactive, know where they live, know what they need to be prepared, wouldn't that be great? Well, it's going to be a big challenge, but I don't think it's something that we should think we can't do. It's just going to take a lot of work. So in this survey, we looked at a lot of different people in Texas in this survey, and we found whenever we compared people living in flood-prone areas to those living in non-flood-prone areas, that there aren't a lot of differences in how they seek information. And we walked into the study thinking, gosh, if you live in a flood-prone area, we would sure think you'd be looking for a lot more of that information. It's not necessarily what we found. So we started asking ourselves why that might be. We did a follow-up survey where we actually tested, is it that these people are already getting so much information that they're actually fatigued with too much? Well, that's not what we find, okay? So what that's led us to think is that they may not be getting a lot of information if they're not fatigued with it. The other thing we found is that some of the things that drive people's decisions to go seek that flood information are the norms. So if they hear from somebody they trust in their community that they've looked up this information, they're a lot more likely to go do it. It's normed in their neighborhood. The other thing we find is that the emotions that people feel around flooding matter. And then the final thing that is a piece of advice for everyone is to communicate the fact that floods are possible, okay? And my team is working on a lot of different ways that are non-math based to communicate 100-year floodplain, 1% chance. All that is so confusing for the average person. So we have some work to do in how we communicate that, but the takeaway here is tell people you're at risk. Floods could happen here, and be really clear about it. Second project I want to talk about, something that my team did for the Water Development Board, and our goal was to identify 4 different groups, target audiences for flood information, and figure out what they need, and figure out what kind of decisions that they make. We did literature reviews, extensive focus groups, and the Water Development Board has these, so a lot of the things I'm going to show you here are preliminary. They haven't been necessarily launched for the state, but they are the types of things that you can start using if you find them helpful. So, overview of the campaign first, before I dive into it. We have a toolkit. It's designed in English and Spanish. We have a general Texas audience message, which is Texans fight floods together. We have a message for people who are newcomers to Texas, and that is check your flood risk. Of course, that would also be shown with some type of a QR code to local information. We have another message for young adults, and that's keep your car high and dry. I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. And then an older adult toolkit, which is mirrored off of the idea that we don't want people to get overloaded and tell them, you've got to prepare these 20 items. Ugh, that's too much for a lot of people. And so the whole idea behind this is take 5, prep 5, 5 minutes. Then tomorrow, when you have more time, take another 5 minutes, prep another 5 minutes. So I'm going to go into detail on a few of these just to give you an example. And I want to start off with, a lot of times, this is the graphic that is shown for flash flood alleys in Texas, counties in Texas. Now, I also have an updated map that I think is incredibly important when you consider all the tragic flooding that happened in Texas in 2025, where flash flood alley is actually a lot broader than what the traditional map often shows. However, if we look at this traditional map, you're also going to see that the counties that are in the dark blue are the counties where people are moving into the most in Texas. They're metropolitan counties. And then, as you're going to see here, Harris County is also a #1 place where people are moving, and obviously it's not in flash flood alley. So let's take a look at why my team came up with this idea that we need to focus on new Texans, people moving to Texas. Well, first of all, last several years, including the latest data in 2025, Texas is at the top of the list for the number of people who are moving into our state. And most of them are moving into these flash flood alley counties as well as Harris County. They primarily move into urban areas, but I think it's important to realize that we also have a lot of people moving from urban areas into some of the more rural flash flood areas in Texas for retirement in particular. The other thing is, think about when you're new to an area. You're having to get your water bill turned on, and you're finding your utilities. It's the prime time for you to actually receive important information like flood risk types of information. So the second group that my team came up with is we're going to target some messages toward young adults, especially young adult males. And here's the reason why. What we see here is that the research consistently shows that they're at the highest rate of risk for driving through floodwaters. As a matter of fact, males are 2 times more likely to die than females driving through floodwater, and that 50% of those victims are below the age of 30. So I did a series of focus groups with young adult males and females and found that they actually don't know hardly anything about flood risk. The other thing is, I showed them turn around, don't drown signs, and they looked at it and they were like, I haven't seen those. Now, just so that you also realize, there's a trend, especially in the urban areas throughout the US and in Texas, that people are driving later in life. So we may not see people getting exposure to our messages, our safety messages on our roads until they're a little older in life. The other thing that we figured out is they love their trucks. So here's the way that conversation went. I showed a bunch of the young adults the turn around, don't drown message. I had some males literally laughing in my focus group going, I'm not gonna die, come on, I got a big truck. It would be fun to drive through that water. Now, you're all flood officials, you've heard this from people before, so it's probably not shocking that that's the attitude and that that's what we hear. But you know what? That's leading to people dying in floodwaters, right? So what I did is I sat down with my graphics person and I said, let's figure out, and tomorrow we're gonna ask them what's most important in their life. Well, they're too young to have a mortgage on a home. Most of them are renting, but they've spent everything they have on those vehicles. So what we did is we were like, let's design a message and test it around their vehicles, and let's center vehicles instead of a human life. I know that sounds trivial, but all of a sudden when we showed them, keep your car high and dry, their reactions were not laughing, they were, oh gosh, I don't want to hurt my truck. The other thing they said is, I don't want my insurance premiums to go up. So it hits them in their pocketbook. This message gets them to realize, you know, if they're at a state in their life where they feel invincible, that nothing can affect them, they do realize that that running water might affect their truck and their car. Some of the work that my team is doing is building on that. We actually just published a paper in 2026 that I will be talking about at TFMA in 2026, where we found that turn around, don't drown and low water crossing signs can be misunderstood, especially low water crossing. And the other thing that we found here is that having those signs out there is important. And the more that people see those signs, the more likely they are to have reported that they've turned a vehicle around. So I feel like our signs are working for some audiences. But I want you all to think about the fact that we rarely can give one message to all the different audiences when it comes to flood risk. So in the future, I'm hoping we can find more targeted messages that can actually change the behaviors of people that we need them to change. The other thing we did is we developed this general customizable message. And so my buddies in Wise County, I've rolled this out in their county and done a lot of work with them, and it's called Texans Fight Floods Together, but it's very easily customizable where it can be Wise County Fights Floods Together, or Decatur is the county seat there, Decatur Fights Floods Together. And let's talk about where this message came from. Well, how many of you have seen "Don't Mess with Texas" signs? Yeah, everybody's seen that one too. It's very common. So Don't Mess with Texas is an anti-littering campaign. And do you know that it has gone down in the research books as being one of the most successful campaigns that we have ever launched in the state of Texas? So let's think about this "Don't Mess with Texas" message. It taps into Texas culture, right? We're individuals. We don't want people messing with us. It's very culturally based as a message in our rugged Texas culture. So what we did is we tried to develop a message about fighting floods, iterated with our focus groups, and came up with something that also taps into Texas culture. And that's where Texas Fights Floods Together, or the customizable messages for the county and city, comes from. Let me show you a bit about how customizable these materials are. So while I was doing this study, I was also working with the Institute for Disaster Resilient Texas on a great project called DRIP, and we were working with rural counties in Texas. And so I sat next to my rural county judges, and I said, do you have a marketing person that does everything for you? Nope. You're looking at them, which is very common. Our rural county officials are wearing tons of different hats, including doing their own marketing. And so are our rural floodplain administrators, right? Those of you out there are doing your own work. So I looked on their computers and I said, what software do you use on a regular basis? They use Microsoft Word, they use PDFs, and they use PowerPoint. They don't have fancy graphics programs. So I went back to my team and I said, everything we design needs to be designed in PowerPoint, because I want everyone who can use a computer to be able to adjust messages as needed. So you'll notice what we've done on these is we chose not a fancy font that's going to mess up everybody's computer when you open them. It's Arial, okay? Everybody has it, and it's in PowerPoint. The other thing we did is we chose a standard blue color, nothing fancy, available once again in PowerPoint. So anyone can go in, modify these materials that we have designed, and customize them, because fundamentally, when we look at Texans, Texans like messages that are local. Think about it. Whenever Hurricane Harvey hit, Houston strong, Fort Bend County strong. You saw all of these rugged Texas messages about coming together. The Hill Country floods in 2025, Kerr together. Like Kerr County wanted that localized message to build momentum for everyone to work together to recover. So customizing is the key. I want to move now and talk about the Texas Integrated Flooding Framework, because this is also something moving forward I think each and every one of you can utilize whenever you're thinking about the tools and resources you're designing for your communities. My team worked specifically on two different components, component 2 and 4, and those talk about communication, outreach, and visualization, so visualizing flood risks. And here's back to this problem, we have these flood tools and products that have been developed. And I literally had a conversation with someone just this past week, and they said, we've developed this really cool thing. And I said, did you talk to the communities? Do you know who's going to use it? No, but it's the coolest thing out there. Well, we're missing the boat when we don't think about, are they going to be able to use this? Are they going to know what the various terms that we're using are in these products and tools that we design? So we find that they're hard to use. They have incomplete features. Furthermore, even those of you who are floodplain administrators, you often don't even know what tools exist in our state. And we have a lot, by the way. So that's a lot of what we were working with on this project. We developed some guidelines for coastal flood user interfaces and tools. And by the way, TIF focuses on coastal products, but a lot of the things that we've developed I think will cross various parts of the state and be applicable. We also had to identify groups of users of these coastal tools that could benefit the most. And then we had to identify ways to communicate to those user groups that we ended up deciding needed to be prioritized. So here's what we have in the guidelines. First of all, whenever we develop dashboards, user interfaces, anything like this, we want to start with determining what's the goal or objective of what we're designing. Second thing we want to do is identify and align with our target users. Talk to humans who will use it before we design these tools and products. Then we design it and we pull in those users and we do some co-design with those users. And the goal here is for us to achieve what my team is calling high fidelity communication. And the idea behind that is communication that's going to land with our audiences the way we want it to land. So let's take a look at how, when we're determining our goals and objectives, what that looks like. And I'm going to be designing a pyramid for you here. And what you'll see is that a lot of times when people design products, they focus on how do we make this usable, how do we make it reliable and trustworthy, and fundamentally at the very bottom it's functional. Does it work? However, I'm going to push everybody to think up to higher levels of the pyramid. And that is it accessible? And also, is it interactive? And the reason these two areas are so important is that when we get to this level, we get into what a user experiences when they use a tool. And that really does matter. If it's interactive and they can figure it out, it's intuitive and it's working for them, they're a whole lot more likely to use it than if it doesn't. I want you all to think about that piece of software that you have on your computer that you use maybe once a month, maybe 2 times a year. When you go back into that software, isn't it like having to learn to use it all over again? Well, when things are designed in a more intuitive way, we're going to increase the likelihood that people are going to get back into those tools more quickly and be more effective when they use them. So our goal here, if we take that pyramid, and it's in the middle of this pyramid, you want to think about who your target audiences are. You want to think about the decisions that they need to make. And then you want to think about your stakeholder community. You want to present this in ways that they can understand and comprehend. And our goal is to change behavior. All right? So that's what's in the guidelines for TIF right now. Now, I do want to remind everybody that it's important that once the design process starts with any kind of a flood-related tool, pull in the users. That's why you'll notice my teams have been at TFMA for the last several years, and we've been showing you ideas before they're developed because we need your input, and we want to be sure that what we're developing meets the needs of all of you. So another thing that's in the communication, the TIF guidelines, are some communication guidelines. And so I've given you about 4 of them here. First of all, think about who you want to deliver messages to your audiences. Make sure they're trusted sources. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Sometimes official sources are also trusted sources. But a lot of times you need to move beyond those sources because not everyone is going to trust an authoritative source. And you want to think about community organizations. Leverage those relationships. Establish what we call social norms around flood behaviors. Say, you live in this community, you know what? We're prepared. People who live in this community, we all know about our homes. We know about the people around us. Norm the behaviors that you want people to engage in. Whenever you present statistics, think long and hard, first of all, if you actually have to use a number, because there's a concept called numeracy that is very challenging for a lot of people to understand anything with numbers. But if you're going to use statistics, use them carefully and really try to translate them for your audiences. And then finally, we forget how important stories and narratives are when we're trying to explain important life-saving information. Lean into that. It can really be a fantastic tool for you. I also want to show you how we identified some of the target users. And I think you won't find it surprising that with some of the users that we identified. But the first thing that we did is we reviewed the literature and put together some charts around how people make decisions around risk and around flood risk. So, you'll start looking at how are people even aware that they're at risk? And then if they are, do they understand it? Do they feel like they can do anything about it? All of these are really important pieces of background information that will help you be able to better communicate with your audiences. Now, for example, this is one of our prioritized groups, and it is our property owners. And we deliberately called it property because it's more than just home. Sometimes we have landowners, we have agricultural work that's happening on property. And a lot of these same different stakeholders, federal agencies, your groups, are all playing very important roles to inform those property owners about their risk. But I think one of the most important things that we realized in doing this project is property owners are completely different from renters, property renters. That is something that there's been very little research done on, and we're starting to get a handle on this and going to continue doing a lot more because they have very different needs than someone who has purchased a home or purchased property. All right, I want to now take these guidelines and put them into action for you by showing you a real-world example of a project that I'm working with the Institute for a Disaster Resilient Texas that's funded by the GLO. And along the way, we've gotten some funding from several other groups at UT Austin to help us with this as well. So as we're designing this new product for local flood officials and floodplain administrators, the first thing we're doing is we're determining goals. So what we did as a team is we went through and we looked at what's available in Texas right now because we don't want to be redundant. We don't want to create something that's already out there. The second thing we did is we did a lot of interviews and when I say a lot, we've probably interviewed now close to 100 people about what their various needs are. We've also surveyed a lot of people to get input to understand these needs. In 2025 at TFMA, our team hosted a workshop to show everyone all these various tools and also to get feedback on the early phases of this new product that we were developing. And our next step is to incorporate what we've learned from there into a pilot tool, and at TFMA in 2026, we'll be back in a workshop to share what we got from you, how we incorporated that, how we've developed a flood toolkit, and how we've developed some videos that, spoiler alert, that don't talk about a floodplain using any numbers at all. Stay tuned. You'll learn more in 2026 about this. So to wrap up, I want to just kind of remind you all the different things we've talked about today. I hope you've learned a lot about the resources that we have been developing in Texas over the last decade. We talked about these different project tools that can help you be able to communicate with public audiences. I shared these guidelines from the TIF project that wrapped up, and everything will be public in that in 2026. And then finally, shared a quick example of how my teams are already starting to use those TIF guidelines to create a tool for local flood officials, to use data in a lot more sophisticated ways, and maybe be able to pull all those different data sets into one platform, so you're not going out there trying to remember where you stored all these different pieces of data and trying to make everything work together, especially when the data sets are at different scales or maybe you can't remember what's exactly in the data sets. So excited to see where that project goes. You know, we have a lot of great work that's happening in Texas, and I don't want us to forget that we have made a lot of progress. Yes, we have a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress in the last decade. Our major needs moving forward are, we need to be targeting to meet the needs of specific audiences. If we think we can use generic messages and reach all of our different groups, we're sadly mistaken. We need to tailor these messages. Second, we need stronger communication approaches. It's not always fun to communicate with all the audiences that those of us in this room have to talk to, right? It's not. But if we don't communicate with them, they will go out and find the information that they want to know from another source. So if we have ideas and ways that we can communicate, we can increase the likelihood we can be that authoritative source for people. And then finally, we need some ways to coordinate all of our flood-related work in the state of Texas. We need to be testing messages very systematically to be sure that they work on the audiences that we do. You know, my team is doing a little bit of that work here and there, but boy, I'd love to see that happen on a much grander scale. I'd like to end by thanking, I have so many collaborators on these projects, and just because I'm here sharing them with you, please know we have graduate students who have done incredible work. I have amazing colleagues at the University of Texas as well as at Texas A&M. And we have a ton of different organizations that we've worked with, from CHARM to Texas Advanced Computing Center to AgriLife Extension, as well as our state agencies and our federal agencies as well. So I appreciate your time. I really hope you will all go forth after this and think about ways that you can communicate, and maybe you'll be a little less frustrated the next time you look at something and it's super technical, and you'll think, how could I explain that in a little different way to these various audiences that are bombarding me and asking me for information constantly? That's my hope, y'all, and I really appreciate the time I got to spend with you. Thanks.